By early December 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared close to resolution. Paris had been liberated in August. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, crossed France at unprecedented speed, and reached the borders of Germany in barely 3 months. To many Allied commanders, the German army looked finished. This confidence was misleading. The Allied advance had outrun its supply system. Fuel shortages forced armored units to halt. Ammunition deliveries lagged behind frontline demand. Entire divisions sat idle not because of enemy resistance, but because trucks could not reach them. Patton's Third Army, advancing through Lorraine, felt this problem more than any other formation. In September 1944, Patton had been within operational reach of the Saar and the Rhine. Instead, fuel was diverted north to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. Patton never forgot this decision. By November, the Western Front had slowed into a grinding advance. The Hürtgen Forest chewed up American infantry. Aachen fell, but at enormous cost. The Germans were retreating, but not collapsing. Inside Germany, Hitler reached a dangerous conclusion. The Allies believed the war was nearly won. That belief could be exploited. German factories were still producing tanks. Fuel reserves, though limited, had been stockpiled for one final gamble. Divisions shattered in Normandy had been rebuilt with fresh conscripts and veterans transferred from quieter fronts. Hitler decided to strike where the Allies least expected it: the Ardennes, the same forest used in 1940 to break France. To the Allies, the Ardennes was a quiet sector held by exhausted or inexperienced American units. To Hitler, it was the last place the enemy would expect a major offensive. While Allied intelligence focused on the Ruhr and the Saar, German units quietly moved at night. Radio silence was enforced. Units marched under forest cover. Even German commanders were told only fragments of the plan. Patton, meanwhile, was fighting a different war. In Lorraine, he faced stiff German resistance around Metz. The fighting was slow, technical, and brutal. Yet Patton was already thinking beyond the immediate battle. He studied weather patterns, road networks, rail junctions. He issued standing orders for contingency planning, something few other commanders bothered to do. Patton believed one thing above all else: the Germans were not finished, and if they struck, speed would decide everything. Before we continue, subscribe to www.2 Declassified. This channel covers World War II through verified records, real operations, and declassified material. If you are interested, subscribe now. Hitler's decision to attack through the Ardennes in December 1944 was not impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and rooted in both history and desperation. By late autumn 1944, Germany faced a strategic reality it could not escape. In the east, the Red Army was regrouping for a massive winter offensive. In the west, Allied forces were pressing against the German frontier. Germany no longer had the manpower or fuel for prolonged defense on both fronts. Hitler rejected a defensive strategy outright. He believed defense guaranteed defeat. His only remaining option was a decisive counterstroke that could fracture the Allied coalition. The Ardennes offered 3 critical advantages. First, terrain and expectation. The Ardennes forest was considered unsuitable for large-scale armored operations in winter. American commanders viewed it as a rest sector. Units stationed there were either understrength, recently arrived, or recovering from earlier fighting. German intelligence correctly identified that the Allies did not expect a major attack in that region. Second, weather. December. Weather in the Ardennes brought heavy cloud cover, snow, and fog. This neutralized Allied air power, which had been devastating since Normandy. German planners understood that without Allied fighter bombers dominating roads and bridges, their armored columns could move with far greater freedom. Third, strategic payoff. Hitler's objective was not merely to push the Allies back. His goal was to drive west to the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. If successful, this would isolate Montgomery's forces in the north, shatter Allied logistics, and potentially force a negotiated peace in the west. The plan was codenamed Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Later, to deceive even German troops, it was renamed Herbstnebel, Autumn Mist. The attacking force was massive by late-war German standards. It included the 6th SS Panzer Army, equipped with the newest Panther and Tiger II tanks. The 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel formed the central thrust. The 7th Army protected the southern flank. In total, the Germans committed over 200,000 troops, more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and nearly all remaining fuel reserves in the west. Speed was essential. The plan assumed German armored columns would reach the Meuse within 4 days. This timetable left no margin for delay. Every road junction mattered. Every hour lost reduced the chance of success. Bastogne emerged as a critical objective because it controlled 7 major roads. If Bastogne held, German armor would be forced onto narrow, congested routes, slowing the advance and burning precious fuel. German planners believed Bastogne would fall quickly. They did not anticipate a stubborn defense, nor did they anticipate the speed at which Patton could intervene from the south. Crucially, the German plan relied on one fatal assumption, that the Allied command would react slowly. Hitler believed Allied generals were cautious, methodical, and rigid. He believed they would require days to reorganize, argue over command authority, and redeploy forces. In most cases, he would have been right. But he had not planned for Patton. Before the offensive even began, Patton had already considered the possibility of a German counterattack. He had studied the Ardennes road network. He had identified pivot points where his army could turn north. He had ordered staff officers to prepare plans that assumed sudden, large-scale German action. While German armies moved into position, Patton was quietly preparing for a war that had not yet begun. The Battle of the Bulge did not succeed initially because German intelligence was superior. It succeeded because Allied intelligence failed to interpret what it already possessed. By December 1944, the Allies had unprecedented intelligence advantages. Ultra-decrypts from Enigma traffic were providing daily insight into German communications. Aerial reconnaissance had mapped rail yards, bridges, and depots across western Germany. Prisoner interrogations consistently showed German units were exhausted and under strength. Yet these strengths produced a dangerous effect. They reinforced complacency. Most Allied intelligence officers believed Germany no longer had the capability to launch a major offensive in the West. Fuel shortages, manpower losses, and air superiority were assumed to make large-scale operations impossible. When fragments of contrary information appeared, they were dismissed as defensive repositioning. In early December, several warning signs emerged. German units disappeared from known defensive positions. Rail traffic increased at night. Volksgrenadier divisions, newly formed and lightly equipped, began replacing experienced units along quiet sectors. These movements were rationalized as preparations for defense against an Allied Rhine crossing. Even more alarming were reports from the front lines. American patrols encountered unfamiliar German units in the Ardennes. Prisoners spoke of upcoming attacks, though most lacked specifics. Increased artillery registration fire was noted in multiple sectors. German night patrols became more aggressive. These reports were forwarded up the chain. They went nowhere. Allied command culture in late 1944 favored confirmation over contradiction. Intelligence assessments were built around what commanders already believed. The prevailing assumption was that Germany's remaining strength would be used to defend the Ruhr, not to gamble on a massive counteroffensive. Weather played a decisive role in masking German preparations. Persistent cloud cover prevented effective aerial reconnaissance in the Ardennes. With Allied aircraft grounded, German columns moved almost entirely unobserved. Patton's headquarters received many of the same intelligence summaries as other commands. What set him apart was how he interpreted uncertainty. Patton did not believe intelligence existed to predict enemy action with precision. He believed intelligence existed to suggest possibilities. Where others saw improbability, Patton saw risk. In late November, Patton instructed his staff to consider scenarios involving a sudden German attack in the Ardennes or against the Third Army's flank. He ordered contingency planning not because he expected an attack, but because he believed surprise was Germany's only remaining weapon. This mindset was rare. Most Allied commanders were focused on their immediate sectors. Patton thought in terms of operational shock. He asked questions others did not. What if the Germans struck where resistance was weakest? What if they attempted a breakthrough instead of a defense? These questions did not yet translate into action. Patton could not redeploy forces without authorization, but they shaped how his staff worked, how maps were prepared, and how orders were written. When the German attack came on December 16th, it shocked nearly every Allied headquarters. It did not shock Patton. Within hours of the first reports, he began activating plans that already existed on paper. While other commanders scrambled to understand what was happening, Patton moved directly to the question that mattered most. How fast could he attack? In early December 1944, Patton's Third Army was positioned far south of the Ardennes, engaged in hard fighting across Lorraine. Its primary objective was the German Saar region, one of the Reich's industrial gateways. The terrain was difficult, the weather worsening, and German resistance remained organized. The Third Army was not resting, it was actively fighting. Patton commanded one of the most aggressive field armies in the Allied order of battle. By December, it consisted of 3 corps, 9th Corps, X Corps, and 8th Corps, comprising multiple armored and infantry divisions. Units like the 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, 80th Infantry Division, and 90th Infantry Division had been in near constant combat since Normandy. This constant pressure produced 2 opposing realities. On one hand, the Third Army was experienced, flexible, and accustomed to rapid movement. Its officers were used to Patton's demand for speed and initiative. Orders were short. Decision-making was decentralized. Staff work emphasized execution over paperwork. On the other hand, the army was strained. Casualties had accumulated, vehicles were worn, fuel shortages, limited operational freedom. Winter clothing was insufficient in many units, a problem that would become severe within weeks. Logistics remained the central constraint. Patton's advance had repeatedly stalled in the autumn because fuel was diverted elsewhere. This created frustration, but also discipline. Third Army logistics officers became experts at squeezing movement out of minimal resources. Traffic control units learned to manage long columns on narrow roads. Engineers became skilled at rapid bridge repair and route clearance. These skills would prove decisive. Geographically, the Third Army sat in a position that few appreciated at the time. Its southern location placed it within striking distance of the Ardennes, if it could turn north quickly. The road network from Lorraine into Luxembourg and southern Belgium offered multiple axes of advance, but only if movement began immediately. Patton understood this better than anyone. He maintained constant situational awareness beyond his assigned sector. He followed developments along the entire Western Front, not just his own battles. He studied maps of Luxembourg and Belgium despite having no orders to operate there. Most importantly, He had already asked his staff a critical question. What would it take to pivot the entire army north? Weeks before the German offensive, Patton had ordered his operations staff to quietly prepare contingency plans. These were not formal requests to higher command. They were internal exercises. Routes were identified. Timetables were drafted. Fuel requirements were calculated. Artillery displacement plans were outlined. Patton did not tell most subordinate commanders why these plans existed. He believed in preparation without announcement. At the same time, Patton pushed his army relentlessly in Lorraine. He wanted German forces tied down. He wanted the enemy to believe the Third Army was fully committed south and incapable of rapid redeployment. This served two purposes. It fixed German units in place and preserved surprise if Patton needed to move. It also hardened his own formations under real combat conditions, ensuring they would respond quickly when ordered. By mid-December, Patton's Third Army was not the largest, best equipped, or best supplied Allied force, but it was the most responsive. When the German offensive erupted on December 16, 1944, this difference would matter more than numbers. Because while other armies struggled to understand what was happening, Patton was already focused on the only question that mattered. Where would he hit first? December 16, 1944. The offensive begins. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, the German army launched its final major offensive in the West. More than 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire across an 85-mile front in the Ardennes. The barrage was short, precise, and designed to avoid warning the Allies too early. German infantry advanced immediately behind the fire. The initial attack struck the U.S. 8th Corps, a formation spread thin across rugged forest terrain. Many American units were under strength, some recently arrived, others recovering from earlier fighting. Defensive positions were incomplete, communications were fragile. Within hours, German Volksgrenadier divisions infiltrated American lines, bypassing strong points and severing road links. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating the single greatest Allied advantage. By midday, reports of breakthroughs flooded Allied headquarters. At Supreme Headquarters, confusion dominated. Initial intelligence assessments suggested a local counterattack, not a full-scale offensive. Commanders debated German intentions while frontline units fought for survival. Patton's headquarters in Lorraine began receiving fragmentary reports by late morning. Unlike other commands, Patton did not ask whether the attack was real. He assumed it was. Within hours, he ordered his staff to retrieve contingency plans that had already been prepared. He demanded updated estimates on road conditions, fuel availability, and unit readiness. He asked how fast divisions could move if ordered north. By the evening of December 16th, Patton concluded that the German attack was not limited. It was operational in scale. He predicted that Bastogne would become a decisive objective because of its road network. While Allied commanders debated, Patton acted. He alerted Corps commanders that a major redeployment was possible. He instructed them to prepare to disengage selected units on short notice. He emphasized speed, not perfection. That night, Patton recorded in his diary that the enemy had committed his last reserves. He believed the Germans were gambling everything. On December 17th, the situation worsened. German armored spearheads advanced deeper into the Ardennes. Malmedy fell. American units were surrounded or overrun, roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. Command and control broke down in several sectors. Patton followed these developments closely. He recognized that the German advance was faster than Allied reaction. He also recognized that the Germans were vulnerable. Their supply columns stretched behind advancing tanks. Fuel consumption was far higher than planned. Every delay mattered. Patton began positioning his army mentally and logistically for one outcome: a counterattack. But before he could move, he needed authorization. That authorization would come at a meeting that would define the entire battle. Verdun. On December 19, 1944, senior Allied commanders assembled in Verdun, France. The atmosphere was tense. The German offensive had shattered the illusion of Allied momentum. Entire divisions were cut off. No one yet knew how far the Germans intended to go. Present were Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied forces north of the penetration, and George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army. Eisenhower opened the meeting by acknowledging the severity of the situation. The German breakthrough threatened to split the Allied front. Immediate counteraction was required, but available forces were limited. Discussion focused first on stabilizing the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Montgomery argued for consolidating defenses and slowing the German advance. Bradley emphasized restoring cohesion and preventing further encirclements. Patton spoke last. When Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could attack north toward the German flank, most commanders expected an answer measured in weeks. Redeploying an entire field army in winter conditions was assumed to be a slow, complex process. Patton's answer stunned the room. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Eisenhower pressed him. Patton clarified. His army could pivot north and strike the southern flank of the German penetration, relieving pressure on Bastogne and disrupting German momentum. This was not bravado. Patton produced plans, routes, timetables, corps assignments. He had already prepared them. Eisenhower immediately grasped the significance. If Patton could deliver on this promise, the Germans would face a coordinated counterattack far sooner than expected. Eisenhower approved the plan on the spot. Patton left Verdun with authority to turn his army north. As soon as he exited the meeting, he began issuing orders. There was no delay, no further debate. Messages went out to corps commanders instructing them to disengage and move. The scale of what Patton was attempting cannot be overstated. He was turning an entire army, over 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, on frozen roads, in combat conditions, under enemy pressure, in the middle of winter. Most armies would have taken a week just to begin such a movement. Patton had 48 hours. As Third Army columns began to pivot, German commanders still believed the Allies were paralyzed. They assumed resistance would collapse inward, not strike outward. They were wrong. Because while the German offensive continued pushing west, Patton's army was already moving north to hit it in the flank. The order to pivot the Third Army north went out on the afternoon of December 19, 1944. What followed was one of the most complex troop movements executed by any Allied force during the war. Patton did not issue a single sweeping directive. He issued layered orders, timed to the hour. Corps commanders received clear movement priorities. Units were told exactly when to disengage, which roads to use, and how fast to move. There was no room for interpretation. Speed was everything. The Third Army's movement depended on traffic discipline. Thousands of vehicles had to move along narrow, icy roads without clogging intersections or blocking supply routes. Military police units were deployed in large numbers to control junctions, reroute columns, and keep traffic flowing around the clock. Patton personally emphasized this point. He told his staff that a single stalled truck could delay an entire division. Vehicles that broke down were to be pushed off the road immediately. Repairs could wait. Movement could not. Weather conditions were brutal. Snow and freezing rain covered the roads. Visibility was poor. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Drivers operated headlights under blackout conditions to avoid drawing enemy attention. Frostbite cases increased rapidly. Despite this, movement continued without pause. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's primary striking force, was designated as the spearhead. It began moving north from the Saar region toward Luxembourg. Infantry divisions followed, securing routes and preparing to expand the attack once contact was made. Artillery units faced their own challenges. Guns had to be displaced, moved, and re-emplaced on frozen ground. Ammunition stocks had to follow closely behind. Artillery commanders coordinated closely with engineers to ensure bridges could support heavy loads. Fuel remained a constant concern. Patton prioritized fuel distribution ruthlessly. Non-essential movement stopped. Training vehicles were grounded. Every available gallon was directed toward units designated for the attack. Fuel trucks moved as part of combat columns, not as separate logistical elements. Communication was another critical factor. Radio traffic increased dramatically, but Patton insisted on brevity. Orders were short. Reports were factual. There was no tolerance for unnecessary commentary. The chain of command remained clear, and subordinate commanders were expected to act without waiting for detailed instructions. German air reconnaissance remained limited due to weather, allowing the movement to proceed largely unobserved. This preserved operational surprise. German commanders did not initially realize the scale of the redeployment taking place to their south. By December 21st, Patton's forces were in position to begin attacking northward. Units were tired, cold, and short on sleep, but cohesion remained intact. The pivot had worked. Patton had achieved what he promised at Verdun. His army was in motion, aligned for attack, and ready to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. The next objective was clear. Bastogne. German operational planning for the Ardennes offensive was built on a series of assumptions. Most of them were reasonable. One of them was fatal. German commanders believed the Allies would react defensively, not offensively. They expected the Americans to fall back, consolidate, and wait for weather to clear before attempting a counterattack. This belief was rooted in earlier Allied behavior and reinforced by the shock achieved in the first days of the offensive. They did not expect a rapid, large-scale maneuver from the south. The German focus remained fixed forward. Armored spearheads pushed west toward the Meuse. Supply columns followed slowly behind. Fuel shortages began appearing almost immediately, but the offensive timetable left no room for correction. Bastogne was treated as a secondary objective. German planners believed it would be taken quickly or bypassed. When the town did not fall immediately, German units attempted to encircle it rather than commit large forces to reduce it. This decision diverted strength from the main thrust and created a critical vulnerability. German intelligence failed to detect the Third Army's movement. Several factors contributed to this failure. Poor weather limited aerial reconnaissance. German radio intercepts were overwhelmed by volume and lacked clarity. Allied deception, intentional or not, masked the scale of the redeployment. Most importantly, German commanders did not believe such a maneuver was possible under winter conditions. By December 22nd, German forces around Bastogne began encountering increased resistance south of the town. They assumed it came from local American units attempting to break out. They did not yet realize an entire field army was approaching. Patton's attack plan was direct. The 4th Armored Division would drive north toward Bastogne along narrow, contested roads. Infantry divisions would follow, widening the corridor once contact was made. Artillery would support the advance from prepared firing positions as soon as ground could be secured. The Germans, meanwhile, were stretched thin. Units tasked with holding the southern shoulder of the Bulge were weaker than those driving west. Volksgrenadier divisions lacked heavy weapons. Anti-tank defenses were inadequate against massed American armor. Supply shortages limited sustained resistance. As Patton's forces advanced, they encountered stiff but localized opposition. German units fought hard, but they lacked depth. Once penetrated, their positions collapsed quickly. The German High Command began receiving reports of significant American movements from the south. These reports were dismissed initially as exaggerations. By the time German commanders understood what was happening, it was too late. Patton's army was already closing on Bastogne. Inside the town, American defenders were holding on under siege. They did not know when relief would come. They only knew that they were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Time now became the decisive factor. By December 20th, 1944, Bastogne was surrounded. The town was defended primarily by elements of the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by combat commands from the 10th Armored Division, field artillery units, engineers, and scattered support troops. In total, roughly 18,000 American soldiers were trapped inside a tightening German ring. Bastogne was not chosen for defense because it was ideal terrain. It was chosen because it could not be abandoned. 7 major roads converged there. In the Ardennes, roads mattered more than ground. Control of Bastogne meant control of movement. If the Germans held it, their armored columns could maneuver freely. If the Americans held it, German timetables collapsed. The German encirclement formed quickly. Units of the Panzer Lehr Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division pressed in from multiple directions. Artillery fire increased daily. Supply routes into the town were cut. Conditions inside Bastogne deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow covered the ground. Foxholes froze solid. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Many wounded lay untreated for hours. Ammunition shortages became critical, particularly artillery shells and small arms rounds. Air resupply was impossible at first. Heavy fog and low cloud cover grounded Allied aircraft. The defenders rationed everything. German commanders believed the town would fall within days. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached American lines under a white flag and delivered a written demand for surrender. The demand cited overwhelming force and warned of total destruction if resistance continued. The American response was short. Nuts! The message, approved by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, spread quickly among the defenders. It did not change their situation materially, but it mattered psychologically. It confirmed that surrender was not an option. German assaults intensified. Infantry attacks probed the perimeter daily. Tanks attempted breakthroughs along key roads. Artillery bombardments increased in volume. Each attack was repulsed, but at a cost. American casualties mounted, supplies dwindled further. Inside Bastogne, the defenders did not know when relief would come. They only knew that if it did not come soon, the town would fall. Outside the perimeter, Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north. Progress was slower than hoped. Roads were narrow. German resistance stiffened as Patton's intent became clear. The race was now defined. Could Patton reach Bastogne before the defenders ran out of time? Patton's attack toward Bastogne began under conditions that favored the defender. Snow, ice, limited visibility, and narrow forest roads reduced the effectiveness of armor and complicated coordination between units. The 4th Armored Division led the advance. Its mission was direct: drive north, break through German blocking positions, and reach Bastogne as fast as possible. Speed was essential, but Patton understood that reckless advance would stall the attack entirely. German resistance was stronger than anticipated. Units defending the southern approaches to Bastogne included elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and reinforced anti-tank detachments. Though not elite formations, they were positioned on favorable ground and fought with determination. Roadblocks, mines, and ambushes slowed progress. On December 22nd and 23rd, American forces advanced only a few miles at heavy cost. German anti-tank guns knocked out several American tanks. Infantry assaults were slowed by frozen ground that prevented digging proper foxholes. Casualties mounted steadily. Patton monitored the situation closely. He resisted the temptation to divert forces prematurely. Instead, he ordered pressure maintained across the entire front. He believed that German defenses would crack under sustained attack, especially as their supply situation worsened. Artillery played a critical role. As American units secured firing positions, artillery battalions were brought forward despite difficult conditions. Guns were emplaced on frozen ground. Ammunition was stockpiled forward. Once operational, American artillery began to suppress German defensive positions effectively. Air support remained unavailable due to weather. This forced Patton to rely entirely on ground forces. He adjusted tactics accordingly, emphasizing combined arms at close range and deliberate clearing of roadblocks. By December 24th, progress remained slow, but German resistance showed signs of strain. Prisoners reported shortages of ammunition and food. Communications between German units were increasingly disorganized. Patton shifted pressure to exploit these weaknesses. He ordered the 37th Tank Battalion and supporting infantry to focus on a narrow axis of advance. This concentration of force began to pay dividends. German positions were penetrated, forcing withdrawals. Time, however, remained the enemy. Inside Bastogne, supplies were nearly exhausted. Wounded soldiers waited for evacuation. Morale held, but endurance had limits. Patton understood that relief had to come soon, even if it meant accepting higher risk. On December 25th, he pushed his forces forward despite growing fatigue. Christmas Day passed under fire. There was no pause, no celebration. The following day would decide the outcome. By the morning of December 26, 1944, Patton's Third Army had one remaining objective: break through to Bastogne that day. The task fell to Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division under Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was aggressive, disciplined, and deeply trusted by Patton. His orders were explicit: do not stop short of Bastogne. German defenses south of the town were thin but dangerous. Anti-tank guns covered road approaches. Infantry occupied forested high ground. Mines slowed movement. Weather conditions remained poor, limiting visibility and coordination. Abrams adjusted tactics. Instead of advancing in broad formation, he concentrated tanks and infantry along a single axis. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Infantry protected armor at close range. Artillery fire was used to suppress known German positions rather than blanket entire areas. Progress was measured in yards. By mid-morning, Abrams' column reached the village of Assenois, just south of Bastogne. German resistance stiffened briefly, but American artillery and direct tank fire overwhelmed the defenders. At approximately 16:45 hours, Abrams' lead elements broke through the German ring and reached the outskirts of Bastogne. Contact was made with the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st Airborne Division. The siege was broken. The corridor was narrow and vulnerable. German fire continued to threaten the route. But the psychological effect was immediate. Inside Bastogne, word spread quickly. Relief had arrived. Patton's reaction was restrained. He did not consider the mission complete. He understood that a single road into the town was insufficient. German forces could still cut the corridor if pressure was not maintained. Orders went out immediately to widen the penetration. Infantry divisions moved forward to secure flanks. Additional armored units reinforced Abrams. Artillery was brought up to protect the corridor. Within Bastogne, supplies began moving in. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. Artillery ammunition replenished defensive batteries. The defenders could now hold indefinitely. For the German army, this moment marked the beginning of the end of the offensive. Their timetable had collapsed. Fuel shortages worsened. The chance of reaching the Meuse evaporated. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge, but it ensured the Germans would lose it. Breaking into Bastogne was only the first phase. Holding that connection under German pressure was just as critical. The initial corridor into Bastogne was narrow, exposed, and vulnerable to artillery and counterattack. German units immediately attempted to sever it. Artillery fire targeted roads, infantry assaults probed American positions. Any successful German counterstroke could have re-isolated the town. Patton anticipated this. Within hours of the breakthrough, he ordered additional units forward to widen the corridor. Infantry divisions were tasked with securing high ground on both sides of the road network. Armor remained positioned to counter German thrusts quickly. The 26th Infantry Division and elements of the 80th Infantry Division moved aggressively to expand the perimeter. Fighting was close and often confused. Forested terrain, limited visibility, snow-muffled movement. Engagements occurred at short range. German resistance intensified briefly. Units from the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and remnants of armored formations attempted localized counterattacks. These efforts lacked coordination and adequate support. Fuel shortages limited the use of German armor. Artillery ammunition was scarce. American artillery now operated at full capacity. With weather improving slightly, Allied aircraft also began to reappear. Fighter bombers attacked German supply routes, further degrading their ability to sustain operations. By December 27th, the corridor widened significantly. Multiple routes into Bastogne were secured. The immediate threat of re-encirclement diminished. Inside Bastogne, defensive pressure eased. The 101st Airborne transitioned from survival to stabilization. Units rotated positions. Casualties were evacuated more efficiently. Supplies flowed steadily. Patton did not stop at relief. He ordered continued offensive operations to push German forces back and reduce the Bulge itself. His objective shifted from rescue to destruction. German units south of Bastogne were to be eliminated or forced into retreat. This shift was decisive. German command now faced simultaneous pressure from the north and south. The offensive's momentum was gone. Fuel shortages became crippling. Vehicles were abandoned. Artillery pieces were destroyed by their crews to avoid capture. The Battle of the Bulge entered its final phase, and Patton's role was not finished. Once the corridor into Bastogne was secured, the fundamental logic of the German offensive unraveled. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and uninterrupted movement along key road networks. All three were gone. German armored spearheads had advanced far beyond their supply lines. Fuel shortages became critical. In many units, tanks were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Ammunition resupply slowed to a trickle. Communications between forward units and higher headquarters deteriorated rapidly. Patton's continued pressure from the south accelerated this breakdown. As Third Army units pushed outward from Bastogne, German formations were forced to redeploy defensively rather than offensively. This shift destroyed any remaining chance of reaching the Meuse River. The offensive timetable, already unrealistic, became irrelevant. German attempts to stabilize the southern shoulder of the Bulge failed. Volksgrenadier units lacked the strength to hold ground against sustained American attacks. Fallschirmjäger formations fought tenaciously, but were outmatched in artillery and logistics. Without air support and with limited fuel, German armor could not mount effective counterattacks. Meanwhile, Allied coordination improved. With Bastogne relieved, Eisenhower was able to synchronize operations between northern and southern forces. Montgomery's forces began pushing south. Patton continued driving north and east. The Bulge narrowed under pressure from both sides. German command decisions grew increasingly desperate. Hitler refused to authorize a timely withdrawal. He insisted on holding ground that could no longer be supplied. Orders became contradictory. Units were told to advance, then to hold, then to counterattack, often without sufficient resources. This confusion was deadly. Entire German battalions were cut off and destroyed. Equipment losses mounted rapidly. Veteran crews were lost in increasing numbers. The German army's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the West was effectively ended. Patton's Third Army played a central role in this outcome. By maintaining constant pressure, Patton denied the Germans the time they needed to regroup. He exploited their logistical weaknesses relentlessly. His insistence on aggressive action prevented the enemy from stabilizing the front. By early January 1945, the German offensive had clearly failed. What remained was a costly, grinding withdrawal. The Battle of the Bulge had become a battle of attrition the Germans could not win. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. The numbers matter because they explain why the German gamble failed permanently. Between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945, Allied casualties totaled approximately 185,000 dollars. Of these, around 89,000 were American, including roughly 19,000 killed, making it the deadliest single battle in U.S. military history. British casualties were significantly lower, concentrated mainly in the northern sector. German losses were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but German casualties are generally placed between 80,000 and 100,000, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing. What makes these losses decisive is not just the number, but who was lost. Germany lost. Thousands of experienced infantrymen it could not replace. Large numbers of trained tank crews, hundreds of tanks and assault guns, many abandoned due to fuel shortages, irreplaceable logistical vehicles, including fuel and ammunition transports. By late 1944, Germany no longer had the industrial capacity or manpower pool to recover from such losses. Every destroyed Panther or Tiger represented weeks of production and months of crew training that would never be replaced. Fuel losses were even more damaging. The Ardennes offensive consumed nearly all of Germany's remaining fuel reserves in the West. Once those reserves were gone, German armored units became largely immobile. Even surviving tanks often could not be moved. This had long-term consequences. After the Bulge, German armored formations on the Western Front were incapable of mounting large-scale maneuvers. They could defend, delay, and inflict casualties, but they could no longer attack decisively. Patton's Third Army paid a price as well. Third Army casualties during the Bulge numbered in the tens of thousands, including heavy losses among infantry units and armored crews. Winter exposure added to the toll. Frostbite and cold injuries affected thousands, temporarily reducing combat effectiveness. But critically, Third Army losses were sustainable. American industry replaced equipment rapidly. Replacements arrived continuously. Fuel and ammunition flowed in overwhelming quantities once weather improved. The exchange ratio favored the Allies decisively. For every tank or gun the Americans lost, they replaced it. For every vehicle the Germans lost, they lost future operational capacity. This asymmetry explains why the Bulge, despite shocking the Allies, ultimately accelerated Germany's defeat. When the fighting ended, the German army in the West was exhausted, under-equipped, and permanently weakened. And one commander's actions had amplified that outcome more than any other. Publicly, Eisenhower maintained balance. He praised cooperation, Allied unity, and collective effort. He avoided elevating any single commander above the rest. This was deliberate. Eisenhower believed coalition warfare depended on restraint, not personal acclaim. Privately, his assessment of Patton after the Battle of the Bulge was far more direct. Eisenhower understood exactly what Patton had delivered. In private correspondence and post-war reflections, Eisenhower acknowledged that Patton's rapid counterattack from the south was decisive. It restored initiative at the moment Allied command risked losing it. It prevented the German breakthrough from becoming a strategic disaster. Eisenhower had many capable generals. Patton was different. What Eisenhower valued most was not Patton's aggressiveness, but his predictability under crisis. Eisenhower knew that when chaos erupted, Patton would not hesitate. He would not wait for perfect information. He would move. This reliability mattered. At Verdun, Eisenhower did not ask Patton if he thought he could attack in 48 hours. He asked if he could. Patton's answer was not theoretical. It was operational. Eisenhower trusted it because Patton had earned that trust repeatedly since Normandy. After the Bulge, Eisenhower privately stated that Patton's Third Army had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. He recognized that no other Allied army commander had been positioned, prepared, and mentally inclined to act as Patton did. This did not mean Eisenhower approved of Patton's personality. He remained concerned about Patton's public statements, political views, and tendency to provoke controversy. He continued to limit Patton's public exposure and carefully manage his role within the coalition. But in military terms, Eisenhower's judgment was clear. Patton had done exactly what was needed, exactly when it mattered. The Battle of the Bulge confirmed something Eisenhower already believed. Patton was not a balanced commander. He was a crisis commander. And in December 1944, that was precisely what the Allied war effort required. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked a strategic point of no return for Germany on the Western Front. After January 1945, Germany no longer possessed the capability to influence the course of the war in the West in any meaningful way. Before the Bulge, there was still a narrow theoretical possibility, however unrealistic, of forcing the Western Allies into a slower advance, buying time to stabilize the Eastern Front, or create political fractures within the Allied coalition. Hitler's gamble was designed to achieve exactly that. After the Bulge, that possibility vanished. The offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves. Panzer divisions that had taken months to rebuild were shattered in weeks. Fuel stockpiles earmarked for future operations were expended or destroyed. Replacement crews no longer existed in sufficient numbers. More importantly, the psychological balance shifted permanently. The Allies had been surprised, but they had recovered quickly and decisively. German commanders now understood that even a perfectly concealed offensive could not break Allied operational resilience. The Allies could absorb shocks and respond faster than Germany could exploit success. Patton's role accelerated this realization. By attacking immediately and relentlessly, Patton denied Germany the one thing it needed most after the initial breakthrough: time. Time to consolidate gains. Time to redistribute fuel. Time to reinforce weakened sectors. Without time, the German offensive collapsed inward. After the Bulge, German defensive planning in the West became purely delaying in nature. There was no longer any expectation of regaining initiative. The objective shifted to slowing the Allied advance long enough to evacuate civilians, move industrial assets, or reposition forces against the Soviets. Politically, the outcome was just as decisive. Any lingering hope within the German leadership of negotiating separately with the Western Allies disappeared. The Allies had demonstrated unity under pressure. Eisenhower's authority remained intact. The coalition held. The road to the Rhine was now open. What followed was not a new campaign, but the final phase of defeat. The Battle of the Bulge did not change Patton's personality, but it cemented his reputation in a way no previous campaign had. After December 1944, Patton was no longer merely an aggressive field commander. He was recognized, quietly but firmly, as the man who had restored Allied initiative at the moment it mattered most. Operationally, Patton's authority increased. Eisenhower granted him greater latitude in planning and execution during the final months of the war. Patton's Third Army continued its eastward drive with fewer restrictions and faster approvals. Where earlier in the campaign Patton had been constrained by fuel allocations and political considerations, he now benefited from confidence earned under crisis. Patton's confidence also hardened into certainty. He believed the Bulge proved his core philosophy: wars are won by attacking, not reacting. He viewed the German failure as confirmation that speed and pressure could break even well-prepared defenses. This belief shaped how he fought the remainder of the war. In January and February 1945, the Third Army crossed the Sauer River, smashed through German defensive belts, and pushed rapidly into central Germany. Resistance was fierce in places, but cohesion was gone. German units retreated, surrendered, or dissolved. Patton's relationship with other Allied commanders remained complicated. He respected Eisenhower deeply, but continued to clash with Montgomery's approach. Patton believed that Montgomery's cautious style prolonged the war unnecessarily. These views were not always expressed privately, creating ongoing tension. Despite this, Patton stayed focused on operations. By March 1945, Third Army units were crossing the Rhine, capturing bridges intact, and advancing deep into German territory. The tempo set during the Bulge never slowed. Yet even as his military stature peaked, Patton's political position became more fragile. His outspoken views on post-war Germany, the Soviet Union, and occupation policy began to concern Allied leadership. While valued as a commander, he was increasingly seen as a liability in a changing strategic environment. The Bulge had proven Patton indispensable in war. Peace would be different. When assessing George S. Patton's career, historians often point to Sicily, the breakout from Normandy, or the dash across France. Each was impressive. None carried the same strategic weight as the Battle of the Bulge. Sicily showcased Patton's speed, but it did not alter the strategic balance of the war. The breakout from Normandy demonstrated operational brilliance, but by then Germany was already losing momentum. The advance across France was extraordinary, yet it unfolded against an enemy in retreat. The Bulge was different. In December 1944, the Allies faced their greatest crisis on the Western Front. The German army struck with surprise, mass, and intent. If the offensive succeeded, it could have delayed the Allied advance for months and reshaped the political landscape of the war. Patton intervened at the decisive moment. He did not exploit an existing success. He reversed a developing disaster. His response was not incremental. It was immediate and comprehensive. He did not wait for clarity. He acted under uncertainty. Measured by key criteria, the Bulge stands apart. Speed. No other Allied commander redeployed an entire field army in 48 hours under combat conditions. Foresight. Patton's contingency planning existed before the German attack. His response was fast because it was prepared. Impact. The relief of Bastogne destroyed the German offensive timetable. From that point onward, German defeat was inevitable. Risk. Patton accepted operational risk deliberately. He understood that delay was more dangerous than action. Result: the German army lost its last opportunity to influence the war in the West. This is why the Battle of the Bulge represents Patton's greatest victory. Not because it was his most dramatic advance, but because it was the moment when his entire approach to war, preparation, speed, pressure, proved decisive at the highest level. If you want more fact-driven World War II analysis like this, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. New episodes break down real operations, real decisions, and real outcomes using verified historical records. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.